Thank you, Chairman Langford. I think in the last week we have seen, or actually 2 weeks, we've seen no greater examples of the critical need for trained, experienced, compassionate, and empathetic federal workforce. And my great applause goes out to all the men and women of every agency of the military who have worked so hard to protect lives, protect property, and offer hope to so many people who are now in the process of recovery from both Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma. And so I think it's a wonderful backdrop to have this discussion, because I think way too often hearings like this tend to be perceived to be critical of our great federal workforce. And as Chairman Langford just said, we represent amazing people who do amazing work, who could find much more lucrative careers in the private sector, but choose instead to serve our public. And so my kudos and my great gratification for the work that's being done by the federal workforce. I continue to believe that our subcommittee's oversight of agency reorganization is absolutely essential. Federal employees are a critical part of the federal government. We can't have government our nation and citizens need without strong, focused, and vibrant federal workforce. While I greatly appreciate the time and insight from today's witnesses, I am disturbed that the Office of Management and Budget has declined our invitation to appear before the subcommittee on this timely subject. There's no one closer to the heart of what's going on in this reorganization than OMB, and it's vital for our subcommittee to understand the interplay between OMB and the federal agencies that it is now seeking recommendations, reform recommendations from. It's unacceptable that OMB chose to not testify at this hearing, and I'm going to do everything that I can to try to ensure their presence at our next hearing on this topic, and I hope Chairman Langford will join me in that effort. I also will be doing all that I can to protect our federal workers, and I look forward to hearing about the impact that reorganization process has on those workers thus far in today's hearing. Again, I thank the witnesses for their testimony. I greatly appreciate all of the time that it takes to participate in a hearing like this. I know it's not easy. Preparation of testimony is a critical component, and I look forward to your thoughtful comments on this reorganization process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's two steps to this process, and the first step is the low-hanging fruit. Where we could all sit down across the ideological spectrum and say, this is crazy. Why are we doing it this way? Why can't we be more efficient in what we do? Why do we have to have three agencies that do exactly the same function, that are just in the business of turf protecting, when we have so much other important work to do? And so, you know, there is enough work to do in this country. We don't need to make work. And I think we can all agree that that's the baseline. Another really interesting, kind of parallel here is this agreement that we're management heavy, that we have too many layers of management. It probably creates little fiefdoms, probably creates more competition for protection of that function than what it should. And so I want to explore the management structure and what you perceive, I think, Mr. Reardon, because you're probably closest to what's happening with reorganization right now. Is this an issue that's being tackled by any of these agencies that are now looking at government efficiency?
Thank you, Ranking Member Heitkamp. I am close to this, and from what I've seen in my experience, agencies are not tackling it effectively enough. If, for example, you look at CBP, right now in CBP, there is something on the order of one supervisor for every 5.7 employees. In 2003, I believe it was, that number was one supervisor for every 12 employees. Now, I ask you to couple that with the fact that across CBP, we are short something on the order of 4,000 CBP officers and 631 agriculture specialists. And it's important to recognize what these folks do. Not only do they help protect our country through the ports of entry, but they also protect us in terms of, insofar as the agriculture specialists, making sure that pests don't come in and ruin our crops and so forth. And so there is also an economic element to this because they help move people, tourists, as well as freight into and out of our country. So it is important to make certain that we have the staffing that we need for these agencies, such as CBP. So
I just want to kind of add to my frustration about what happens to Border Patrol and agents who are frontline. When we had the surge at the border of unaccompanied minors, they carry a gun, but they were changing diapers. That makes no sense.
Right.
That's not the function that they signed up for, and it creates morale problems. It creates real challenges for those Border Patrol agents. And so getting them back on patrol should be our top priority. But if you take a look at reorganization coming from Congress, probably the worst example, in my opinion, is the Department of Homeland Security. Why is that? Because as Ms. Gressler, is that how you say her name? Ms. Gressler said, there is no oversight. There's no consistent oversight from Congress. We shoved all these agencies together, said good luck. We bring them in and we beat them because, your morale's poor, you're not functioning the way you want to function. But we take no responsibility on this side of the dais for the challenges that we've created with no commitment to overall oversight. And I think you see that repeatedly. And what I'd like to just reiterate, this subcommittee is incredibly committed to actually creating an oversight system of the work that's being done right now, whether it is in the planning or whether it is in the implementation of this oversight. We can't just have this oversight, this new reorganization, been there, done that. Now we all can take a bow when we go out to talk to the cameras, and then behind it is chaos. We need to take responsibility here for what we're not getting done, and I think the Department of Homeland Security is a critical component. Mr. Edwards, you raised this question of the tiered management system. How pervasive, when you do the judgment, you just heard Mr. Reardon say, 1 to 6, 1 to 12. When you think about benchmarks for management to frontline workers, what do you think that ratio, let's assume you agree that these are all functions we should be performing in the federal government. What do you think that ratio should be?
I don't know what should be precisely. I mean, there's a whole academic literature on span of control and the like, but there is academic research that I've looked at major U.S. corporations. They are flatter. The spans of control have increased.
Can you give the numbers you gave in your testimony again? You said the United States government.
So Paul Light at Brookings has found that the number of layers in a typical federal agency has doubled since the 1960s, and he's done this interesting analysis looking at titles of federal employees, and there's far more employees today than in the past that have long, fancy titles like assistant deputy, rather than frontline folks. One of the points he makes is that, and we saw this after Hurricane Katrina, which I read quite a bit about and looked at the official reports on, there's no doubt in my mind that one of the chief screw-ups, the federal screw-ups after Hurricane Katrina was that the Department of Homeland Security was new. There were so many different layers that the communication became very, very difficult. And there was this huge complexity of decision-making. No one knew who was responsible for what. And so I think I think communication flows more quickly when you have fewer layers of management. I think rules and regulations are easier because everyone knows who's responsible. Well,
I just want to tell kind of a personal story before we hear from Mr. Shea. I once was a federal attorney, and I had every time I wrote a letter, I had a routing slip, right? And it had to be signed off by 3 levels, 4 levels of, and of course, you've got to justify your existence, so you send it back with changes. And by the time the top guy changes what you just did, the bottom guy doesn't like it. Right. And so you can imagine the lack of, number one, efficiency, but accountability. At the end, who was really accountable for that letter? There was no one accountable for that letter. And when I went to state government as an attorney, I went into my supervisor and I said, "Can I have the routing slip?" And he said, "The what?" I said, "The routing slip where I have to get approval to send this letter out." And, I'm 25 years old or 26 years old. And he looked at me and goes, "Well, did you research that letter?" I said, yeah. You think you said the right thing in that letter? I said, "Well, yeah, I worked pretty hard on it." He goes, "Then sign it and send it." And you know what the message to me was, look, you're accountable. And when you add those layers of supervision, you eliminate accountability for the work that's being done. And I think it creates an attitude that maybe I don't have to take responsibility for this because it's going to be the guy at the top. Mr. Shea, you want to comment before I turn it back over to
You just remind me
Senator
of
Langford?
my first days at OMB when every memo or circular had to be signed off on in physical hard copy, and you had some documents literally as high as the dais that some bloke had to carry around office to office to get signed. Luckily, we've gone electronic. I'm sure they're giving it the same diligent review they did then. I think it's important to note, and Rachel said this in her testimony, that if we don't tackle fundamental personnel reform in conjunction with reorganizations, you won't get the benefits that you hope. Agencies cannot recruit and retain the workforce they need to accomplish their missions. It's the chief challenge we find when we survey chief human capital officers, chief financial officers, chief information officers. So unless agencies have the flexibility to mold the workforces they need to accomplish the mission you hope they'll accomplish when you reorganize them, you won't get there.
But I do want to make this point, is that we have created an atmosphere where a mistake could be catastrophic. So people are afraid of making mistakes, and that creates paralysis. We have to have a level of tolerance for things not always being perfect. And I think when you look at management structures, you know, if you want a zero mistake tolerance standard, you'll get nothing done. You know, I had a governor who had a sign on the wall. He said, if you made no mistakes today, you really didn't get anything done.
You're talking about the culture of an organization.
Right.
And leadership can overcome structural barriers to creating that culture in organizations with sustained leadership. We get to manage in an environment where senior leadership turns over sometimes as frequently as every 18 months. So you can play an important role in making sure there's a sustained attention to whatever culture it is you want to see at an organization, including one that's risk tolerant.
I would resist a little bit what you're saying, Rachel, because I'm a huge proponent of the XM Bank. You mentioned the XM Bank in your testimony. I don't think that's a waste of manpower. I think it's a critical piece of our trade infrastructure. You know, I'm frustrated because we reauthorized the XM Bank by almost a 60% majority here, making a statement, hearing all of the arguments, and it was a tough fight, and we still don't have a fully functioning bank, because on the outside, we have challenges coming from a number of the groups that are represented here. I get it. And so, you know, there comes a time when you have to say, look, we lost that fight. Let's focus on the things that we can agree on. Let's focus on duplicative programs. Let's focus on not the ideological programs. Maybe those come later. But we don't have a big discussion in this country very often about where are the boundaries. I'll give you, for instance, we had a banking committee where we talked about Bitcoins. And everybody's talking about how they're going to regulate Bitcoins. It got to me, I said, stop it. It's buyer beware. You want to deal in Bitcoins and you lose your life savings, that's not on me. But the minute the government touches it, it says, it's okay, we're regulating it, therefore you can have some sense of security around using this currency. And so I think we don't have those foundational arguments, and those foundational arguments, when we get into it, distract from where the soft spot is, where we can all agree across ideological barriers. And so I would say that instead of fighting the fights about whether we're going to have a Consumer Finance Protection Bureau or an XM Bank, let's talk about how we can reduce the frustration of frontline employees in performing these functions, how we can identify what Senator Langford just talked about, places where we don't need these folks to be doing what they're doing. We have a lot of other things they could be doing. And why does anyone want to spend their life doing something that doesn't add value to the American public? They don't. These employees do not. And so, you know, I think that one of the things that we could do is lower the ideological barriers and really get to that efficiency measurement that we could all agree on. And when you're talking about cost-benefit analysis, right? I mean, there's a lot of discussion here. I'm all for that. You know who should be performing cost-benefit analysis on existing federal expenditures? The Appropriations Committee, the oversight committees that authorize these programs. And we should have a greater sense of skepticism about the program. We should be a much more critical reviewer of these programs regardless of our ideology. And so I would say that we could really do some great work here if we just agreed that the hardline, hard-fought ideological battles about various agencies got set aside, and we could work on the low-hanging fruit, build trust, build relationships, and then continue the discussion.
I do think you could structure a commission, you could give it, a narrow window. These are things that you're going to address, and these are things that are off limits. But I would worry a little because there's so many of the issues that are ideological. I see federal, personnel and compensation reform is crucial to this. No matter how many agencies you eliminate or reorganizations or duplications you get rid of, if you don't change the personnel structure, the way that we hire and fire employees, the way that we compensate them, the government can't attract and retain the best and brightest employees that they want to right now, and it can't get rid of the ones that it needs to. And that's something that even if you have the perfect structure and you're only performing the functions you should, you still need the appropriate personnel organization and way to go about that. And so I think that yes, you can limit the functions of a commission or whatever reorganization plan it is, but there's always going to be some partisan issues in there.
Mr. Reardon, I think.
I think it's important to recognize that a lot of these workload and personnel issues really come down to a need of process improvements, not really an overhaul of laws. We can hire people, we can pay them, but the fact is that it's got to be funded. And when I talk to my members, what I hear from them are things like, they don't have the resources that they need to do their jobs. I think I've mentioned this before, and it still is stunning to me that, for example, in the IRS, there are people, many people, not just sporadically around the country, all over the country, that do not have office supplies to do their jobs. So, funding to have the tools and the resources to do the job is important. I would also mention to you that training dollars, not only training dollars for frontline employees so that they have the knowledge to do the work, and times are changing, and people need to be trained to move along with those times, but also training for managers. Managers have a lot of the tools at their disposal right now to deal with employees, problem employees, but the fact of the matter is they are not sufficiently trained to do that work. And, ultimately, a lot of this, candidly, comes down to staffing. I mentioned CBP. IRS, for example, since 2010, has lost on the order of 20,000 employees, 20% of its workforce. And that's obviously the organization that brings in 93% of our country's revenue. Something's wrong there. So, my views.
Yeah.
Mr. Shea, I think, had a-
Mr. Shea, were you going to comment on that? And I want to add a question if you're not.
Sure. I just want to endorse Rachel's idea. A similar bill we proposed during the Bush administration to create a commission that would produce recommendations and go to Congress for an up or down vote, and you could narrow the scope of that commission in such a way. And that's based on the success of the base realignment and closure commissions, which were specifically designed to overcome potential roadblocks that they would face in the Congress. On the cost-benefit analysis, I mentioned in my testimony the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. The government is investing more and more to rigorously evaluate its programs. They generally are found not to be effective, but it's really hard, expensive, and takes a long time to do these evaluations. It's our hope that if the recommendations of the Commission are implemented, it'll be easier to get that data so that you can find the few diamonds in the rough that are actually having an impact and at what cost, so that you can compare the cost effectiveness of programs across government.
I think if you go back and take a look, let's talk about supervision. I have a bill that's been supported by a lot of folks on supervision. We're going to reintroduce it this Congress because I agree with you. I think people used to tell me in state government when I ran agencies that you couldn't fire people in state government. I said it's news to me because I fired a lot of people who weren't functioning. I mean, there is a process, and I think that we sometimes hide behind that, that process to avoid the confrontation. And I think frontline workers who tend to get promoted if they're good at what they do may not be the best supervisors, and we need to move that along. But when you look at duplication, we're going through this whole exercise. We don't need all of this, review to know that there's duplication. We have had GAO come in here incredibly frustrated because they say the same things over and over again, the same report over again, and nothing happens. And why is that? Because we don't do appropriate oversight here. There's no cameras that are going to come in here. If we were having a committee hearing on Equifax, we'd have, tons of people waiting outside that door. It's the issue du jour. It's the topic du jour that sucks the oxygen out of the room in Congress when we should be doing the yeoman's-like work on this side of the dais to improve the quality and competence of the federal government, building, again, the commitment that American public has and the sense that they have that we're doing the right thing. It's not a sexy thing. I think what we're doing here isn't sexy, but we're committed to doing it the right way and making sure that we have some results that we can build on when we build on the trust. And so, Mr. Reardon, you wanted to...
Yeah, one of the other things that I would add that I think that we all kind of run into is, this notion that the federal government is somehow bad, that federal employees are somehow bad. They're swamp creatures. They're in the swamp, and
They are right now because they're helping us with hurricane relief.
well, that's exactly true. You're exactly right about that. They are some of our greatest first responders, without question. So I think the political rhetoric, and it's been around for decades, right? But it has really taken hold to the point where I do a lot of meetings with our members, and I routinely have people say to me, why does Congress feel this way about us? And they just can't get their minds around why so many in Congress, at least some of the public statements that are made in the media and so forth, or maybe some in OMB, they can't get their minds around why people feel so negative about them. And so our federal employees, in large measure, do not feel valued. There's been a lot of talk here about trust. Federal employees don't really feel as though they trust management either. So there are some things that I think that really need to be paid attention to in our current system, and the trust between the front lines and management, I think is certainly one of those things. And I would add that when we talk about first responders and we talk about people from CBP officers from San Francisco and around the country going to whether it's to help in Hurricane Harvey or Hurricane Irma, I would also like to point out that FEMA brings people in to answer phones. And one of the groups that they brought in were a number of employees from the IRS. And the IRS, did really a great job of providing people so that they could help on that. So there are all kinds of federal employees, not only pulling people out of floods and so forth, but that do a lot of different kinds of work. And so we should really, and I hope the day comes where we value on the whole federal employees.
Excuse me, we received some great comments from the Partnership for Public Service, and so we want to ask unanimous consent to enter that testimony into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Yeah.